All right, to discuss, we're joined by the head of land reform at Worksmen's Attorneys, that's Bulelwa Mabaso. Thank you for being with us, Ms. Mabaso. This has been discussed and debated at length. We finally have a law. Is it a good one?
Yes, I mean, this act comes 50 years later. You'll recall that the primary legislation that South Africa has been using to expropriate is the 1975 Act, which was an act of parliament, obviously, that predates our constitution. I think what's important to note here is that expropriation as a concept has always been a state power that many governments across the world use when they need land for purposes of a public purpose, such as building roads and hospitals and clinics. And in South Africa in particular, we have a unique addition in that it is also allowed for purposes of a public interest, which would include the nation's commitment to land reform. So this is a welcome development because, as I said, we were all along relying on a 1975 Act, which didn't have the constitutional safeguards that come with the promotion of administrative justice, that provides a landowner who's subjected to expropriation with the right to be heard, with a right to offer an amount of compensation, and in fact to even refuse the expropriation. So what this act introduces, in effect, are the constitutional provisions that our constitution are actually based on, which did not exist in the 1975 legislation.
And presumably nobody's been using the 1975 legislation because we saw the EFF's Julius Malema stand up saying we need expropriation without compensation. That needs to be law. So was this always presumed to be a dead law in effect?
The Expropriation Act has always been used, Francis. It was used by the apartheid government. It's still used today. It was used when the Gautrain, for example, was being constructed. The difference here is that the Expropriation Act of 1975 only made provision for market value compensation. In other words, it did not matter whether the land in question, how it was acquired, when it was acquired, and for what reason. The only compensation model that the 1975 Act had was pure market value. What this does is that the Constitution makes provision for just and equitable compensation, which is a different methodology from just looking at pure market value. Just and equitable compensation looks at the current value of the property or the land. It looks at current use of the land. It looks at whether or not there was state acquisition of the land and improvements and so forth. And of course, the purpose for the expropriation. So the EFF position was that there's got to be nationalization of land where nobody could have property rights, where the state would then hold land on behalf of everybody. So in other words, the EFF position was advocating for a nationalization of all land, whereas this particular act does not eradicate or threaten property rights in that it only makes provision for nil compensation under very specific instances. And if I have time, I mean, I could state what those instances are. Those would be, for example, where land has been abandoned, and we've seen recently lots of examples of inner city buildings that have not been taken care of, where owners have not been found, where the buildings have been abandoned. What this act does, it allows a deviation from payment of compensation to allow the state to expropriate those buildings under those narrow circumstances. But also, it also includes circumstances where landowners hold on to land, not for any other reason, but just to sit on land and watch it kind of grow in terms of its market value. So that's another circumstance in which expropriation without compensation would apply. And that would also include where land poses safety hazards for the nation. And so I think what's important to point out about this piece of legislation is that it brings along the constitutional safeguards that first, it did not exist in the 1975 Act. Secondly, it provides for a mediated process, a symbiotic process of engagement between the states and anyone who is subject to an expropriation, which did not exist before. But then I think, again, for purposes of clarity, what it does is that it provides then those limited circumstances where expropriation would not be payable. And listening to your previous interview with the economist that came before me, I would agree that this is a welcome development in the sense that investors are now not going to be beholden by the sense of fear-mongering that has been happening whenever the word expropriation is brought to the table.
Yeah, because we already had in the Constitution that idea of just and equitable compensation. Some people said it could be zero anyway. But now we have clarity. Are the safeguards enough to assure the farmers? There was always a concern about farmers, some of them incredibly successful with tracts and tracts of land, but that is being used productively, so they can rest assured.
100%, Francis. And in fact, if you look at what land is kind of open for an expropriation, a farming enterprise that has created jobs, that is being used for purposes of the nation's food security, and where there's productivity happening, that would not be a property or land that is geared for expropriation. And in fact, what the safeguard does with this new act, it says that before the expropriation notice can even be issued, there's got to be a notice of intention for expropriation. There's got to be an involvement of the municipal manager of the municipality. There's got to be involvement of other government departments such as land reform, environment, water, in order to ensure that the land that is being subject to expropriation is actually needed for the expropriation concerned. And so in an example that you've given of a successful, productive farming enterprise, that would not be suitable for an expropriation. And it would actually fail dismally when it comes to being implemented in accordance with what the law provides.
All right, the head of land reform at Worksman's Attorneys, Bulelwa Mabaso, thank you so much for speaking with us tonight on SA Tonight, and thank you at home for being with us.